Hey guys, welcome back to the Music Habits podcast. This one's going to be a little bit different. I've got Dan from the Live Producers Online podcast. And Dan kind of does everything Ableton, which happens to be my DAW of choice as well. And many of the listeners use Ableton, even though we talk more about the philosophies that can be used universally. So, Dan, yeah, go ahead and introduce yourself. I wasn't even aware that you were in Denver when I first found you, and you
Yeah,
weren't aware that I was either. So, this is kind of our first time connecting. So, it's kind of cool to think that we'll be able to actually do a face to face at some point since we live so close.
yeah, it'd be real awkward if we never saw each other again after this, and we live like pretty close. I mean, that's wild, man. I've been here for 2 years, and you were on my podcast, the Ableton Music Producer Podcast. Dude, I don't even know. That was probably like episode 30, maybe,
That's
like from
right. Yeah.
like 2018 or something.
Yeah. It was a long time ago.
Nuts, dude.
And what's funny is I had some people that discovered me from your podcast that I did with you even back then.
Very good, man. I'm happy to hear that. That's awesome.
And yeah, you've been killing it. You've been really consistent with your podcast. I noticed that you're up in like almost are you like around 150 episodes or somewhere in that?
Just most recent episode was 166 with Claude Von Stroke, Barclay Crenshaw.
How cool is that?
That
Isn't
was
it
fun.
cool that you're getting to the point or have gotten to the point where you can start interviewing some of the I guess the more elite guests, if you will.
Yeah, whatever that means, I guess. I don't know. Dude, I've had people on the podcast who I was like, just super well-known producers, and like they didn't know anything about limiting when I was talking to them, and I'm just like kind of shocking. But like, there's also
Yeah.
I've had some really unknown people who maybe have like 100 followers on Instagram on the podcast, and they're just like absolute wizards with music production. So I think it's all over the place, and I'm just happy to like get to know people and talk to people and from all different backgrounds and experience levels. I feel like I've learned a ton just by doing the podcast, which is why I
Yeah.
started doing it in the
I mean,
first place.
as long if you're keeping the subject in conversation, you can't help but learn.
Yeah.
You can't help but re-ingrain what you already know just by talking about it,
Yeah,
and getting
totally.
feedback from other people. It's interesting what you said because I've told many of my students that, most of the bigger artists out there, it's not like they run circles around everyone else technically. In fact, there's a lot of unknown producers that could produce circles around the pros. And I
Yeah.
just say, the thing about the pros is they know a few things really, really well.
Yeah.
And they don't get themselves stuck in that needing to know more.
Yeah, I think there's a balance with that. Like, I try to never get to a place of where I feel like I'm not learning something new. And I think there's a balance of like staying in your lane as well, of like knowing what you're really good at and being able to capitalize on those things. Like, for example, if you want to be the best future bass producer in the world, then maybe just like really focus on making future bass and get really good at that one thing. But if you want to start writing for TV or film, or even commercials, you might want to consider just working fast at your workflow and being able to crank out music of different genres really quickly and have ideas come out in 30 seconds, like, so I think there's like, it just depends on your goals, what you're trying to do as a producer or singer-songwriter or whatever your goal is. I mean, it's good to identify that and then try to work at that thing or those set of things.
Yeah, I kind of have a similar philosophy. I when I'm working with students who are haven't been at this game long and maybe not haven't even finished their first song, I'll usually suggest that they they focus on one thing and get good at it because the connections that you can make by getting good at one thing can usually be taken to something else. It's kind of like running a successful business, right? It's you got to get that business off the ground. You don't want to open 10 businesses at the same time. You
Mhm.
can't really get anything off the ground, and you're not going to learn from the success of any of them unless you focus on one.
Sure.
But I think once you've had a certain success with your creativity in one direction, it makes it much easier to apply what you've learned to another style of music or, you know, making soundtracks or whatever you're going to do creatively in that avenue.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense.
Now, do you have more of a philosophy of just doing whatever you feel like? Um, and did that come from if you have that philosophy, did that come from the beginning, or did you feel that you had to kind of get good at one thing before expanding? How did that work for you?
I mean, in terms of making music, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, in terms of making music, from the point of let's take you from the point of I've never finished a song before. Um, what were you, did you, first off, everyone makes kind of mistakes in the beginning. Did you notice any mistakes that you had to correct in order to get proficient at finishing some of your first stuff? Or
Honestly, man, like I think I had the mentality. Well, first of all, when I first started learning Ableton, like I didn't even know how to get sound out of it for like a week. And that was like in 2011, 2012 maybe.
yeah,
And then I was just kind of like, screw this, I need to learn from somebody. And this is like, YouTube was just starting to become a thing with tutorials, videos in Ableton. And so I was like, oh, I found Dubspot, and they were kind of the leader of YouTube tutorials. And then I just went to school in New York
yeah,
City to Dubspot in person. So I studied in New York City for a year under some really incredible teachers and producers out there. So I felt very lucky to have that opportunity. And then in that process, like as far as like mixing and making my stuff sound good, like I had no clue. I didn't even know what mixing was. And so but I was just like having a blast, just cranking out music and being completely ignorant in the process. And I would go home after every class to my overpriced apartment that I was renting at the time,
yeah,
and it was just like taking everything I learned and applied and spent at least 2 to 3 hours every day, just like grinding and trying to figure out like how can I take this concept and make music with it. And I made a lot of crap for sure, but at the time I didn't know it was crap. And I think that in that sense, ignorance is bliss when you're not thinking about
yeah,
is this good? You're just actually making what you feel. And I think in that sense, I was actually probably like the ideas I was making, like I still like them to this day because
yeah,
it was what I was feeling. Now, did it sound great? Was it something I'd release on SoundCloud or Spotify? Like hell no. But like the ideas were cool because I was more focused on the idea and actually creating than I was thinking about what other people were going to think about it because I didn't have the intention of releasing it right away. I was just practicing and having fun in the process. And so from that perspective, I was actually really, really enjoying, I think, making music more than I did in many other parts of my life because it was more about learning and having fun in the process than it was trying to create this perfect thing.
yeah. I think it music can be so blissful in the beginning because anything you throw on the canvas is something new. And
Yeah.
you haven't really made a judgment yet of whether that's any good or not.
Yeah.
Anything that you can throw on the canvas is good kind of in the beginning because you've never done it. So it's like that's an accomplishment.
Yeah.
You know,
Totally.
you can get a bass line and a melodic structure and drums all working together
Yeah.
and sounding like they're playing the right notes. The first time you do that, that's like really an epiphany.
Yeah. It's kind of like the whole write drunk, edit sober mentality.
I was
Yeah.
literally going to say exactly that is I think that when you start, you're in that right drunk phase,
Yeah.
which is definitely it's a flow.
Yeah.
Flow is the right drunk phase usually. And it's not always amazing, but um, if you try to put on your thinking cap too quickly, you can
Yeah.
lose some really important inspired ideas that the other side of your brain, the technical side of your brain, probably wouldn't even allow for.
Yeah. I mentioned this in my podcast before, but like I read seven creative strategies for no, what was it? There's a Quincy Jones book. Maybe you can add this out. But Quincy Jones' book, 12 Notes on Life and Creativity. That's what it's called. And
Oh, nice. I've never read it.
it's an awesome book if anybody wants to read. It's short. It's a short book. It's an easy read. You can get it for like, I don't know, $8 on Amazon or something. But he talks about getting into that flow state for writing, and how when he was really struggling with something as a project or writing a score or something, he would just basically lay down next to his bed and put his feet up on the bed. So his feet were like elevated, and he would just lay on his back and he would try to fall asleep. And then when he got to the place of where he was so relaxed and he just kind of emptied his head and just kind of took out any worry or concern or anything, got to the point as if he was taking a nap right before he'd fall asleep, is when he'd get up and write his best stuff. And so I actually tried that a couple times,
Mm,
and it really put me into kind of a little more of that flow state. It didn't mean that it was a success every time, but I did find myself to kind of be a little more open-minded with what I was doing in the moment and perceive things a little better by just like getting all the clutter and allowing my brain to go into more of that beta state and not being so like overconsumed with what am I making, is this good or not, and just kind of getting rid of that clutter in your brain.
That's really interesting. It reminds me, I'm not sure if this is who it was, but I'm just going to say Thomas Edison. Um, it could have been someone else, but that's just the name that's coming to my mind right now. But apparently, what he used to do is he would sit on a one-legged chair, um, and he'd have a spoon in his hand and like a pan or something beneath him. So what would happen? Um, I might be telling two stories at the same time, actually. Maybe the one-legged chair was one thing, and then the spoon thing was another. But anyway, the whole story is they get to themselves to a point of falling asleep, and right when they nod off, they would drop the spoon, or the chair would fall over, and it would spark them up. And at that moment, they would get um, these idea sparks. It was almost like they were stealing ideas from their dream states.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, a lot of really inspired ideas have come from that, apparently. I haven't tried it myself, but I definitely have gotten, right before you go to sleep is where you get these great ideas. And a lot of times it takes a lot of will to get up and record those ideas because you
Yeah,
think, oh, I'll remember this. This is just 3 or 4 notes, piece of cake.
yeah.
The times you don't record it are the times that you really regret it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true too. Is like, and you asked about my process, is I used to try to put a specific schedule. Like when I was working like a big boy job, I was doing like the 9 to 5 thing. And then I'd be
Yep.
like, okay, every day when I get off work, I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna spend like 4 hours on music or whatever. And I'd already be tired by the time work was over. And I'd go home and I just didn't have any creative juice. And eventually I quit my job just to do music and to teach, and it worked out. Um, and so but even then, I still was like, I have to make money, so I have to book all these lessons and private lessons, and I teach at a studio, and I basically just traded one thing for another, and was
Yeah.
still being super busy with the job. But I did have some flexibility in the schedule a little bit, so whenever I felt that creative pull, I would literally just run to my computer and be like, "Hey, I only have 15 minutes, but I'm gonna go hard for 15 minutes, and I feel inspired, so I'm gonna do everything I can in 15 minutes." And I was like surprised how much I got done in 15 minutes. And then,
You ever, or do you ever set a timer for yourself just to like force focus where you're like, I'm not allowed to focus on anything else until this alarm goes off? For
oh
me,
yeah,
I have to kind of set that discipline
yeah,
because otherwise my brain will wander.
yeah.
Trying to even those 15 minutes, can be kind of tricky.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do have times where I force it, and I think one of the best things I've done is create deadlines for myself. Like I use the iCalendar like it's, like a religion. I go into it and I'm like very disciplined now compared to what I used to be because my ADD brain is like I have squirrel brain real bad. I'm all over the place. So I
Oh,
have to
oh yeah,
like
same.
I have to like be really rigorous and be like, you know what? I started this idea or this collection of ideas, and whether I release all of them or not doesn't matter. But I'm going to focus on at least A, B, and C. And then I'm going to put something on my calendar that says, okay, in the next 15 days, I'm going to decide which one of those three I'm going to actually finish and produce. And then after that 15 days, I have like another 2.5 weeks to actually finish it and then get it ready for release. And so I'm actually putting those like milestones on the calendar has been really helpful for making sure that I'm actually accomplishing things. I actually, Mike Monday, if you're familiar with him,
Yeah.
he
I
has a,
think that he's got kind of similar philosophies. When I talked to him once, he's a really cool guy. And yeah, I think his philosophies are kind of aligned with some of the philosophies um, that became, my book, The Mental Game of Electronic Music Production.
nice.
Um, which is it was funny. It was a reason that we didn't work together is because our philosophies were so similar and we had a similar background of our belief system for creativity that we thought that we were going to steal each other's stuff. So, um, although
Well,
I did steal one thing from him, that I told him about is the philosophy of going to bed an hour earlier and waking up an hour earlier. to focus on creative work first thing in the morning. I don't do it extremely often, but when I feel like I'm hitting a lull, I'll pick up that practice again, and it can really kind of boost my productivity again.
Yeah.
So thanks, Mike.
Yeah, he has a really cool system that actually Barclay Crenshaw told me about, and he creates kind of like an NCAA tournament bracket with your music projects. So he'll say, okay, for 2 weeks, every day, for even just like 15 minutes or 20 minutes, it doesn't have to be that long. You're gonna
Mhm.
work on an idea. You're gonna create a new project. It could be a 4-bar loop. It could be like a 1 minute thing. Doesn't matter. You're just creating something. You're showing up, and then after like 2 weeks or so you save all those projects into a folder somewhere on your hard drive, and then you go into Trello, or you find like a project management cloud system like Asana, Trello, any of those that are.
Okay.
You basically create a card for every single project, and then you go back through. You export like a WAV file too to put it in there, so you can quickly listen to each one, and
Okay.
then
Right.
listen to each one. And out of the 20 or 30 that you made, you say, "Oh, this is a really, I really resonate with this. This is a cool idea." So maybe out of that 20 or 30 or whatever, you take half of those, right? They move on to the next round. And then you spend the next 2 weeks working on those a little more, right? And then the process
So
keeps,
are you doing like a group process, almost like a factory work sort of thing, where it's like in the
yeah,
beginning we're doing all creation from scratch, and
yeah.
then during this period we're doing the second stage of all these songs that we think have potential. Is it that sort of thing?
Yeah, exactly. And
Okay.
then
Yeah.
you just slowly keep on moving those down the bracket like like a tournament. And then you get down to your final three or final four, and you've already been working on those like a little bit at a time with these other projects that you've eventually weeded out. And then by the end of it, not only do you have like a set of songs that are probably half finished, but and you're going to finish those eventually. You also have all these other ideas, and you can look back and say, you know what, there was a round of like 15 that aren't terrible. Maybe I'll go back and revisit those later. But then at least you get to a point of where you've got some solid ideas that are you're fleshing out, and they're getting closer to being finished. And then you've got that set of stuff that you can knock out. And I thought that was a really cool way to work. So yeah,
That's an interesting philosophy. I definitely um, go through periods. Now that Ableton's created the iPhone app, I don't know if it works on other phones, but the Ableton Note has
yeah,
been really a godsend for me, especially when I get those kind of half asleep ideas, or I wake up with an idea. I can really quickly um, get something similar to what's in my head, just with the presets that they have and the effects and the automation stuff that you can do right inside the app. Um,
yeah,
and then I'll go back, through them, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, and start plucking those for album content. Although I happen to kind of pluck one, and I kind of have this philosophy, well, you fucking started it, so you're going to finish it.
yeah,
It doesn't matter if you think it's good. I kind of have this philosophy that you can almost make anything good, because it doesn't even have to um, use the original ideas. It's
sure.
almost like you pull it in, and you try to find the best aspects of it. And if
Mhm.
the melody is garbage, then you fix the melody. If
Yeah,
if you added too much stuff to it and you need to strip it down, then you strip it down to the parts. I usually back things up to, oh, that's the part. That's what I had when I was initially excited about this thing before I thought it went to shit. And then I'll build it back up, sort of thing.
yeah,
Because normally I find that it's just a couple things. Um, a certain sound doesn't belong. Um, a certain sound is placed just a 16th or 8th note uh, too forward or too behind the groove to work, or it's like taking up space that something else needs. And just by moving certain notes just back or forward a little bit, all of a sudden I may find that the melody works or the groove works a lot better. Um, and then the third thing is it's just the sound that needs to be changed. Something needs to be a little more interesting about the sound. Um, and I would say that about 80% of the time, maybe I go about it in a bit of like I'm really pushing something that maybe I should have thrown out. But I kind of like the philosophy of, if you've gone through a few songs and you've turned them from junk into something that you really like, then it kind of tells your brain, oh, I could turn anything into something good, you know? And you don't necessarily have to be extremely inspired by everything that you're trying to take to the next level.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. Usually I make like multiple versions of the same thing sometimes in a project. Like if I work on a drop and like maybe the verse and the build up's solid, but I'm like, the drop just feels off. Like I used to just go through and just keep refining that same drop over and over, and I'd do a save as project, and then it would just get out of control. And then I'd be like, okay, well, what did I do back then? I realized I made everything worse. So a
Yeah.
lot of times in the same project, I'll create like down the timeline. I'll just like copy and paste everything, maybe like 50 bars down the timeline, and then
Oh
I'll just
yeah, yeah, I do that sort of stuff, sure.
and chop it up and clean it up, and then I'll do the same thing again. And then I've got like three different versions of a drop,
And
and
it's
then
in your same project. So you
yeah,
could, yep.
you can all see it there. It's much easier just to copy and paste at that point than going back and forth between projects. And like on, and a lot of times I'll even just like take two different drops that I'll make, or three or four or five, and then you've got the rest of the song pretty much finished at that point. I mean, you
Yeah.
just start copying and pasting what already exists, and if you've got different ideas, or that's a completely different song that you might have just made. And the cool
Yeah,
thing,
I'll also throw my samples like a lot of times I'll have like mud pies full of samples or something like that, and I'll just throw them way beyond the time stamp of the actual song. So I just go further down the timeline to grab my samples and pull them in, you know.
yeah, the other thing I also have done too, if I've made stuff, because I've got an insane, like an absurd amount of like projects that are maybe like 20% done. And
We
and
all
I look back at them, I'm like, I'm not really into that style anymore. That's not what I'm going for my music project. But, I've talked to a couple of people on the podcast who've worked in TV and film or licensing sync stuff, and I'm like, it does just because you're not going to release it under your artist name or whatever, it doesn't mean it's complete garbage. You can still sell that stuff. There's like sync libraries that you could try to get a hold of a sync license manager or somebody who,
Mhm.
you can just upload a consistent sound of ideas. Maybe you've got like a bunch of chill hop stuff that could do really well for a commercial or something. Just make a folder and start organizing all of your 20, 30% finished projects that you're not going to release. Just bounce them into a wave, put it into a folder, and organize it by feel or mood. And then you could even just create a new SoundCloud account and just upload all those there and keep that there
Mhm.
as an archive. You just do a quick master of them so it doesn't sound like garbage. Just do a real quick rundown to clean it up and then just export it. And you've got like these organized folders by mood and feel. And then you can float that, to somebody maybe you meet down the road, or you post it and share it in different forums or communities online for people who are looking for types of music or commercial or whatever. You never know what's going to happen. You can get a
Yeah.
check for the next 3 years.
So would this be something like you're kind of sharing sparks of ideas to people that go, I'm interested in this, and then you go back to the project and kind of finalize it for their consumption?
I mean, it depends. Like,
Or
it just
are you saying that the songs are typically got enough going on and they don't need much time worth of music that an unfinished project is enough for them to license?
both. I think
Really?
both. I mean, really, it just depends on the use case. Like, for example, I had a project that I worked on, and it was only maybe 40 seconds long. And there was a local, like, organic restaurant that was looking for a jingle for a commercial they were running. And I talked to my friend, they're like, yeah, they're looking for this type of sound. And I was like, well, I already had these folders organized. And I was like, maybe I'll just go back and just look at maybe these five or six projects. And I just bounced them and I floated them to them. And it's like, actually, we really like this one. Can we pay you like $300 for it? I'm like, sure. So I just gave them the song, made $300 for a project that maybe took me 2 hours. So,
Nice.
there's that. You just never know. So I would
Yeah,
say don't
no, I
do
think
a
it's
project.
important for producers to understand some of the options that they have, that
Yeah.
not everything has to turn into their biggest track or whatever, and it still has value.
Yeah.
And don't necessarily throw anything away, um, because you just never know.
Yeah, I did the same thing for another podcast. There was a podcast that was like women in business or something like that.
Okay.
And, they paid me, I think, like $150 for a project that literally took me maybe like an hour and a half, 2 hours to make. And so I was like, yeah, there you go. You can just have it. I don't care. So you just never know.
Yeah,
So I
that's
would,
great.
yeah.
And are these just serendipitous connections, or do you have like suggestions or of like the type of reach out that you would suggest people do if they want to, um, I don't know, build themselves kind of a little virtual Rolodex of the type of people that might be interested? Does this just kind of come out of thin air, or do you kind of have a few connections that connect you to these people?
So there, I would say if anybody wants to go down that rabbit hole, there's a book, How to Make It in the New Music Business by Ari Herstand, and he writes a lot about sync licensing.
Hmm.
Um, I think he was on the podcast back in the day. But yeah, Herstand, Ari Herstand, ARI. But he talks a lot about that, and he interviews music supervisors, who are the people that are basically in charge of like taking a song and paying you for it, and then using it for TV or film or commercial, whatever. So look into like how to contact a music supervisor. There's books out there. There's a lot of resources on YouTube how to get in contact with the music soup. And there's like all different kinds of agencies that you can contact if you really do want to try to go down that route.
Yeah,
So,
I'm certain that there's plenty of people that will be watching this or listening to this that that's going to be really helpful for.
I mean, I'm not an expert on it to be honest, but I've talked to enough people who are that like have said some really positive things. It can be difficult, and a lot of it is who you know. Um,
Yeah, yeah, we can get negative about almost every aspect of music making when it comes to trying to um, sell our work, um, make ends meet, and that
yeah,
sort of stuff. But there's a lot of people that have beat the odds just by being open to every avenue that comes their way, and
yeah,
and kind of putting themselves in a position to be found.
yeah, for sure. There's like music sync licensing conferences. Just showing up in person and meeting people. That's also a really great way to get connected and to meet people and network and build relationships. And really, in the end of the day, that's what a lot of the music industry is about, is just
Yeah.
making relationships and meeting people and being prepared for when that day comes. That's something I've really learned the really hard way too.
Yeah, yeah, it's preparation is really the key to success.
Yeah,
You never know when it's going to come at you, but if you're not prepared when it does,
if you've never finished a song before, you're probably not ready for that. So, yeah.
right? Yeah. Yeah, speaking of that, what is you did talk about one approach to finishing songs that you learned from Mike Monday. Do you kind of have your approach that you take for finishing projects? I don't know if you're more of a single EP releasing guy or if you like to make a collection of songs that would be considered an album. How does that work for you when you feel the itch to make music?
I mean, for the music I make a lot more like glitch hop, like bass, experimental dance music stuff. I did come from a jazz background, so I play jazz drums, and I appreciate like classical music and all that stuff. And I've played, my project Philia, Philia. It's not the hardcore band from the Philippines. I'm competing for
Okay.
like online real estate against them right now, but yeah, it's. I feel like my approach is really just consistency. And the whole calendar thing too. Like once I have an idea, I haven't been really as rigorous and strategic lately as I have been in the past, just
Okay.
because I've got other interests with my podcast, and I'm like really just practicing and refining my DJ skills right now. So I'm working on a lot of edits, taking songs and mashing them up and like editing them with other tracks, and spending more time doing that than just. I'm always working on multiple projects at the same time. I feel like I try to avoid getting tunnel vision
Hmm.
with just one song. So if I had to go back to my former self starting out producing or in the earlier days, is like don't become so narrow-minded and like infatuated with one creative idea that you stop creating new ideas. Because then there's a balance to that too, because then you'll just never finish anything because you just keep creating new ideas, and that can be a slippery slope too. But my feedback to my former self would be create enough ideas where you can kind of go back through and find a couple that you just really feel in love with, and then just finish those and bounce between them. Like I get really in my own head when I'm only working on just one or two tracks constantly every day or every other day. Because then you just don't even know it's good or not anymore. Like you listen to the same thing over and over and your ears will play tricks on you and then you just like contemplate life. And
Well, I think that's a really good point because, I think that there's a lot of people out there, and sadly, a lot of people that don't finish a lot of music out there that think if you don't spend a lot of time on your music, then the quality goes down. But I actually find that it can be the opposite. It's really easy to overwork an idea until it loses whatever. I think there's got to be a level of imperfection that remains in the song for it to connect in some way. And if you try to get overly technical and make it too perfect, I think it loses a lot. Um,
I honestly go both ways on that because I do know there's been times where I rush stuff and then later on I listened to it like weeks after it released and I was like, damn, I should have spent a little more time on this. But then I've also had stuff that where, yeah, like I overworked it and I either made the song worse or I ended up hating the song and I never released it.
yeah, that's another thing too, is you change perspective when you hear a good thing too many times.
Totally. Yeah, and I've showed those songs that I didn't want to release to my friends and they're like, "What the hell's wrong with you, dude? This is great. You need to release this now." And I'm like, "Really? Like I really?" And sometimes it's good to get feedback from other people too.
It's
Like,
always those songs that people think, I don't even want to put this on the album, that ends up being like the hit song, right? It's
yeah.
really weird. There's so many stories of that sort of thing.
I
So
think it's
yeah, I
also
think it's if you spend too much time on something, then you're going to hate it regardless of whether it's good or not.
yeah. And like I also think that it's really important for that reason to reference in other places. Like I will never finish a song unless I've listened to it in like two or three other spaces. And it like that could be at the gym with my AirPods. That could be, in my car driving in the mountains or something. That could be at a friend's house listening on his crappy speakers, listening on my phone. I'm always listening to at least two or three other places before I release a track, just because not only are you going to hear it from like a referencing point of the acoustics, but you're going to be in a different headspace. And there's something really magical about listening to other people listen to your music.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that is my kind of secret was to kind of slip a new song into a playlist without anyone knowing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that I was expecting anyone to go, "Whoa, what's that?"
Yeah.
It's if someone stops, that's usually a problem because they're noticing a difference in quality. But if it flows well with the rest of the background music in a certain setting or something like that, you know that you're kind of in the game with your song.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky enough for someone to go, "Ooh, what's this? I really like it," that's great too. Um, but if they ignore your song as much as they ignore everything else that's playing in the background, that's actually a good sign, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Like I'll usually like take over the Bluetooth at a party or something and just be like, I won't even say a word about it being my track. I'll just slowly sneak it in there and just read the room. If people stop dancing, then there's a good reason to go back to the song and work on it some more.
Yeah, that's another thing I think with DJing has really helped me when I am considering playing one of my tracks because I'm I'm playing music by so many other artists that I really listen to my own songs. I'll kind of needle drop through them virtually. And just like any other song, it's just like, nope, that's not going to work. Oh yeah, that'll work. And I don't really have a connection of I've made the track. I'm kind of in DJ mode, and basically, yeah, I listen to my own track the way that I would any other, and it's either going to work or it won't.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a nice thing as well to like really get perspective on where your track fits.
Yeah, for sure. Back to like the referencing thing too, Dennis DeSantis, who's the head of education for Ableton, was on the podcast a couple episodes ago. And
Oh, great
we were
guy.
talking, he's awesome. Yeah, he's a super nice guy. We were talking about this with referencing and things like that. And he said that if he's trying to feel out a melody or just like how a song is being perceived, like from a frequency range, but also just like being able to really hear what's happening in the track with the finer details, a lot of times he'll just take his headphones off and he'll listen just through his headphones around his neck, and he'll turn up the volume because really most people are only listening to mid-range when it comes to listening, a lot of times on headphones or whether it's listening on their phone. A lot of people listen to music on their iPhone, sadly. That's all mid-range is really what it is. And so, I one of my friends, Corey or Dennis, also said that he'll get up and walk around the room, which I do a lot. He'll leave the room and just listen to the music
Yeah,
playing.
from outside a room,
Yeah,
you get a perspective that you can't get sitting in front. So there's a couple things
yeah,
that I do that's similar. One, when I'm working up a song, um, I think this came not because I'm super smart or anything, but mainly because of necessity. Because years ago, I developed tinnitus, so I got to be real careful with the volume levels and things with my ears. Try not to fatigue them too much. Uh,
yeah,
for a short period of time, I thought I was going to have to give up making music altogether. It was a pretty scary time. But what I do is I will start up ideas and just produce directly through my laptop speakers. I don't put headphones on or anything because I'm aware of the importance of the mid range. And usually, if I get that part right, um, dialing it in the bass frequencies and the upper frequencies are kind of a piece of cake for me, you know. And yeah, testing the low end, you usually need a little bit of volume for that. So that's when I will, put the headphones on or put on the monitor speakers and turn it up a little louder to get the whole presence. But generally speaking, if you can dial it in and make it sound good on, just relatively decent or even crappy computer speakers, it's usually going to sound pretty good when you put the headphones on or when you go into your studio monitors.
yeah, for sure.
And another thing I'll do sometimes is mix in mono.
Yeah.
Because what I notice is when you mix in mono, one thing is, and I'll turn off instead of having both speakers, I'll just turn one speaker on. And when you do it from that point of view, there's no sweet spot at all. No matter where you are in the room, you're pretty much getting the same sound. So it's a lot easier to get your volume levels dialed in, and it's a lot easier to notice if you got any phasing issues or if you I think it really shines on if you're overdoing it on certain effects like reverb or delays and stuff like that.
Hmm.
That'll jump out at you when you're in mono more than when you're in stereo. And
Yeah.
then once you shift back to stereo, obviously you got to dial in kind of your panning and stuff before you do this because you're losing that. But typically speaking, for mixing, you could keep it at a fairly low volume in mono and get a lot done. And it's usually pretty darn solid by the time you switch back to stereo.
Yeah, yeah, I use the utility effect in Ableton for that on my master, and I have like I key map the mono button.
Hmm.
Then I also key map that to a reference track as well. So I have like two different key maps, and then I can just basically turn off the limiter and the master chains, um, and mute my reference track at the same time. So I assign it to all the same key, so I can just quickly go back and reference to another track. That's like usually a similar genre to make sure it's loud enough and my song is gonna mix well into other tracks. But I also, yeah, mono's a good thing. I made a referencing in Ableton YouTube video not too long ago. It's done pretty well. It's called Tips for Referencing in Ableton Live. Um,
Tips referencing in Ableton Live. Okay.
yeah. And so I talk about like using Ableton Spectrum audio effect. I actually really like using Span now instead.
Yeah, span is really the one for
I
me.
use Span a lot.
It
There's
seems like it really has so much usefulness that I'm kind of surprised that Ableton hasn't done something to kind of give us something more like Span.
yeah.
But Span does its job so well and it's free. So
Isotope has also really done a good job of like releasing some new modules in the last couple years. They have their, I think it's called Clarity module, which is kind of like Soothe, sort of. It like helps control some of the mid-range and the brightness. And then there's the Isotope tonal balance control, which I absolutely love. That thing is like a final check, because you can see the low, mid, and highs, and it's got these like real-time bands that will show you compared to a reference track or just like a genre. Just pick a genre and it has presets, and it'll show you like a real-time balancing of how compressed your low end is versus like your mid-range and your high end and how it's balancing. So I'll use that with like a bunch of different other tools for like figuring out how to balance my mix.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think intelligent EQing is really something that's helpful after I do my main EQ, and I'll just use EQ8 in Ableton most of the time. I mean, I've got the Fab filter, and I honestly just don't use it as much. It's not that one's better or worse. It's just they both get a job done.
yeah,
Um, One, I think the Fab filter is a little more sensitive than the other. It can sometimes sound smoother,
yeah,
but overall, if we get too anal about those tools instead of getting the job done, it can
yeah.
kind of slow us down a little bit. Um,
I love Pro Q3 though, for if I need to be really surgical and I'm having a hard time,
yeah, yeah, for surgical stuff, they make some great stuff.
it's the best
Uh,
one.
and there's also for EQing,
Fast.
obviously a paid plugin, but a lot of people, I know Soothe is really popular, which I don't have, but Gullfoss
Yeah,
is actually pretty incredible as well.
yeah,
And it's really good. I mainly use it uh, just to remove mud. It
yeah,
just finds the mud that I can usually find the mud, in a static frequency, but it's really good at just balancing the mud throughout the track,
yeah.
only removing what's needed. So I kind of use that as an extra step afterwards, and it does make the mixes a bit better, and it handles a lot of work that I really wouldn't be able to do myself.
Yeah, me too. The Golfos master module is really nice. I put that right before my limiter, and it's usually just like extremely subtle.
Yeah, yeah, it's you don't need much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that's a nice one. I like Golfos. Soothe, they OX Sound sponsored the podcast and they make Soothe and I really like that. They also have Spiff, which is like a transient designer. If you want to make a snare or something just like pop and like a little bit harder, that's a good one. Although there, you don't really need it because Ableton's drum bus has a transient in it and it sounds good too.
Yeah, I use that. And there's another transient. Let me see. I'll tell you what it's called right now.
The pack, there's an Ableton pack called Transient Machines that's kind of cool.
Oh, really? I haven't even checked that out yet.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's a pack. I don't know how much it is. It might be included with Suite. I think it came out in Live 9, but you can really destroy sounds with that. It's a multi-band transient shaper, and
Really?
you can do some cool processing with that thing if you know what you're doing.
Yeah, I'll check that out. The transient shaping is really important. I mean, when I was first kind of trying to get the transients, I learned in this book called Mixing with Your Mind. I don't remember his name. I think it's Paul something. Um, yeah, maybe we can hunt it down real quick.
It's Mixing with Your Mind, Paul Stravro?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's him.
Paul Stravro.
Does it have like a little skull on the book?
Yeah, it's
It's
an
like a
expensive.
$100 book.
Yeah, it's expensive.
It's one of my favorite books on music production. Really great. And he taught a trick for compression that almost made it work uh, for almost anything that you do that's really cool. But I used to basically just get my transients from compression before I really discovered transients. And then what I would do is if I needed to, I'd add an extra layer of a really short, like, you know, drum sound or something or a little bit of noise to get the transients. And then I discovered the transient shapers, those plugins, and those are so simple to like they actually do a really good job.
Yeah.
And I find that that's like if there's one thing that's important about getting a good mix, it's really dialing in the transients that are important. I find that a mix can shift from really shitty to really good just by correcting transient problems.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to control those peaks because if those peaks over a short period of time is going to really make your limiter in the final gain staging process work a lot harder. And you can really throw off the balance of your mix if you just have really loud hitting peaks that are like popping
Yeah,
in
that's
the
why it's popular now for a lot of people to use like
clipper
yeah, like
because you're just shaving those peaks off and you're actually bringing up the overall volume of the track if you're clipping on your master or in groups. I mean, I I don't always clip my master. Sometimes I do. It really just depends on what I'm going.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous about clipping masters, but I'll certainly clip individual tracks before it hits the master channel.
I mean, my friend Copycat with two T's, like he's an insane sound designer. Anybody who wants to listen to some wild stuff, like check his stuff out. I think his stuff sounds good. It's just like really aggressive bass, like glitch hop music.
Yeah.
And like he uses sometimes like two clippers on his master with a limiter, and it's just
Really?
like, yeah, he's destroying stuff. But he gain stages it really well, and so that he has enough.
That the whole thing is knowing what you're doing. I don't think there's anything wrong. Like, for example, you've talked to me about a master bus a couple times, and I usually tell a lot of, newer aspiring producers, don't focus on mastering yet until you can make a good mix. Because sometimes running everything into a mastering chain will give you the illusion that your mix is better than you think it is. Do you
Yeah.
have a philosophy on that?
Um, I guess not really. Like I usually just go with what sounds good. I mean, the biggest thing for me is I want to have a really good mix, and the mastering's easy. I don't know. I used to think of mastering as
Yeah,
like this really big special process, and then the more I've been producing and learning from other people, it's not. It's really not. Like it's like if you have a good mix and you know what you're doing, mastering most of the time is just making small tweaks and just like making your stuff louder and making it wider and making sure it translates for like a good bounce to Spotify or whatever. Like it's
yeah. It's
mastering
it's the
shouldn't be that hard. Yeah.
subtle EQ tweaks that I think you have to kind of know what sounds good across the board. In other words, you need some good references and to understand, if you take a song that's a club classic that's in, close to your style of music and you can understand what that EQ balance is, then you can probably get a decent master. Most people try to overdo it by just throwing a bunch of stuff they don't know how to use, compressors and limiters, and they don't understand the subtlety of mastering. And the only thing that they care about is getting it as loud as, the loudest tracks out there. And what I find is if your recording quality isn't there, if your mixing quality isn't there, if your EQing skills aren't there, then if you try to push your volume as loud as some of the most professional studios, oftentimes you'll destroy your track much sooner than these professionals will. So in other words, you know, I usually suggest people go for a slightly quieter mix if they're not proficient with mixing, um, because you can squeeze more if your gain staging and all that is correct beforehand.
Yeah. I
Don't
mean,
have that in place. Like I said, you could be squashing peaks and spikes in your mix that will just kind of destroy what you're trying to do with the master.
yeah, and I think stuff just keeps getting louder. Like over the years, everybody wants the music to be louder because there is something to say, like sonically, your music is going to stand out a little bit, like on SoundCloud, especially if there's not like much normalization happening. Like because if you have a louder mix, like it's gonna be in your face. People are gonna know when that song starts playing. But you also
Well,
have to be
yeah,
careful with that too, because like YouTube and Spotify will turn down your volume of your track if it's too loud. There's actually a really cool website called loudnesspenalty.com that'll actually tell you if that's happening. You can upload your song to. But also, I think you're right. Like knowing how to mix really well is like one of the better skills I think you can have as a producer.
yeah.
Like
Like
you,
if you don't know, if you're learning mixing, um, I usually say get as good of a mix as possible. And the best way to not ruin your mix by trying to master it is just use a utility for gain followed by a limiter and just turn it up. Because if you already like your mix, it'd be hard to ruin something that you already like. And it's easy to correct.
yeah,
I find that songs can sound good on your laptop or on your phone, but I was lucky enough to be a resident when Beta Nightclub was a thing here,
oh, nice.
and that sound system, you could tell when people were trying to master their own stuff. You know, you couldn't tell on a lot of basic systems, but when you get into the professional systems,
Yeah.
big club systems, there's a difference, between a quality mix and one that's not so good.
This is very true. Yeah. I think there's something to say about the club test. Like I've played stuff on big speakers and I'm like, ooh, I need to go back and
My
fix that.
original mixes that I thought were great, I realized by playing in those environments that my bass was about 7 or 8 dB too loud. Like
So
it was a significant amount, and I had to train my ears to compensate for that. So anytime in the beginning, anytime I thought that my mix was perfect, that after that I would like lower my bass by like, you know, 5 to 8 dB, and it would usually be perfect in the club.
yeah, I mean that kind of goes back to like having a good amount of tools that you can reference with that are within your control, given like your setup. A lot of people are just using headphones, and honestly, you can make really sick sounding tracks with like
Absolutely. Yeah.
$150 headphones. Like, and that's it. I mean, Sylvia Massey, who's like one of the greatest engineers of our day, like I mean, did the Rolling Stones and Prince and all those people, and she was on the podcast. She was just telling me like, yeah, I've used just like basic headphones in a hotel room to master tracks before, and they sounded great, you know. So I think it also has
Yeah,
to.
yeah. I still to this day really like, and they're very cheap headphones, but they've just been really reliable. And I know they're not perfect, but the Sony 7506s,
MDRs, yeah, those are
yeah,
nice.
the MDRs are great. I mean, there's a reason that almost every studio uses them. Um,
Yeah, I
and
like
I've used them for DJing as well. I mean, I've used others, but um,
using right now the DT990s, the Biodynamics. These are the 250 ohms, so you probably want a preamp or something to give them some juice.
oh,
If you,
those are okay. So those don't get quite as much volume without a little more.
yeah, you want lower ohms like the 150s if you're just gonna plug into your laptop. But these can, I have them in a preamp, and these things sound so transparent. They're open back headphones too, so they're great for mixing. But yeah, I love those things. They're not that expensive. I think it's like 200 bucks.
Yeah, I usually will tell people that regardless what kind of speaker system you have for monitoring or headphones, if you're not sure, and you can't afford like the best of the best, then get really comfortable with listening to reference tracks that you already know sound great in the best sounding clubs. And if if that song sounds too bright on your system, then you know that you need to turn up the brightness on your track a little bit more. Like you need to kind of compensate for, find the things that your system does wrong by listening to great tracks. And if a track sounds a little bit muddy on your system, then you know that your room is a little bit muddy. So you have to compensate for that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
I have people asking me all the time, like, how do I make my mixes louder? And I've kind of narrowed it down to like four things. The first one I'd say that was a game changer for me is bus limiting. So a lot of times people will be like, all right, I'm compressing on each track, or I'm grouping tracks and compressing them together, and then I'm just gonna hit them all with one limiter on the master. And that doesn't really work anymore if you want to try to get your stuff loud enough. Bus limiting is really a game changer. So I like Pro L. That's kind of my favorite limiter. Although I will say Ableton 12.1, the new beta, just redid
yeah, I'm
the.
kind of excited about that new upgrade.
Yeah, I need to play with that. I haven't played with that limiter yet, but it looks cool, and that's been way overdue. They needed to update that for a long time. But
Yeah.
I like Pro L. I don't even play with the threshold. I'm shoving stuff into it. So I'll put it like, for example, I've got maybe all of my basses or something, and I've got all my lead sounds like lead melodies in a group, and then I've got my drums. So those are like three different groups, right? And
Was
I'll
it group limiting that you're doing?
yeah, so I'm just limiting everything on a group, and then sometimes I'll have that go to a pre-master. So not all
Yeah.
those groups, but some of those groups I'll pre-master, and like my leads, I'll send it to um, basically route that out into either another group or a return track where I have another limiter, and then kind of squishing multiple of those groups into another limiter before it hits the master limiter. And so if you can do that, and you don't need to destroy those with a limiter, but if you can kind of compress and glue those together before it gets to the master limiter, that master limiter is going to have a much easier time controlling all the peaks and
Yep.
everything. It's going to work not as hard, and it's going to
Mhm.
probably provide more clarity to your overall mix and make everything a little bit louder. The other thing I would say, so that's one. The second thing I would say is EQing, like cut out the low end junk of stuff that's not bass because most
Yeah.
of the time you don't need like there's stuff that you're not hearing below like 200 hertz or 150 hertz that it's you can't hear it, but it exists. So carving out stuff that's not bass with a high pass filter and cutting off stuff below like 200 hertz makes a big difference in the end.
Oh, you
And
mean
then just
you mean on tracks that aren't your bass or kick drum
right,
sort of?
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
um,
The other thing too is like mid-range. So like your mid-range too, if you can really tighten up your mid-range as you're compressing and limiting, then there's going to leave more room for clarity in your overall mix. So that's another thing is EQing out stuff that doesn't need to be there. The third thing I would say is saturating. So like if you're not saturating your mix and your sounds, you're not going to get it loud enough. Doesn't matter how hard you're compressing. Like, 'cause you're really just introducing harmonics into the frequency
yeah,
spectrum.
the harmonics actually trick your brain into making, it tricks your brain into definitely for low end.
Yeah.
Saturation is important because it's that if you don't hear the high end, you really don't hear the impact of the low end on those
Yeah.
sounds.
And
In
multi-band
many cases. And
saturation.
it could be so subtle, but it makes a big difference.
Yeah, for sure. And multi-band saturation too. That's why plugins like Saturn or creating an audio effects track in Ableton where you're only saturating certain frequency ranges, because sometimes that can be really piercing if you're aggressively distorting brighter frequencies and you're doing it on multiple tracks that can build up over time. That can start to sound a little harsh in your mix. So then you might have to filter that out with a low pass or something, because that's where you can start to get into aliasing, which can be good or bad. So
Right.
there's things like that to think about too. And then clipping. That was the fourth thing. It's
Yeah.
just clipping on either your master or I clip my kick and snare. So I have a clipper on my kick and I clipper on my snare. And
Do
I'm
you have
just
a favorite clipper that you like to use? Do you use a free one? Do you use a paid one?
K clip is a popular one. There's also standard clip, which I usually use. It's the ugliest interface of any plugin you'll ever find. It looks like Windows XP,
Oh,
but
really?
it sounds fantastic. Like I love standard clip. There's also Orange Clip, which, fun fact, I mentioned this recently on my podcast, but Orange Clip is modeling FL Studio's mixer, because some people, whether on purpose or not, will just destroy individual tracks. They'll have the volume like going past zero.
Oh, yeah.
And FL Studio has a built-in clipper to make it so it's not redlining on your mixers. So people do that whether on purpose or it's ignorance, and they're like, "Yeah, it sounds awesome." And it's because they're clipping. It's just like chopping
Right.
off
Yeah.
peaks at zero. And so they made another plugin called Orange Clip, which is actually that sound, which I haven't used that one, but I've heard good things. I heard it's pretty cool.
That's interesting. It's funny you mentioned the limiting. I ran into a producer. He was kind of one of kind of Sasha, if you know
Oh
DJ
yeah,
Sasha, yeah. He was part of his
actually
production team.
actually opened up for him back in the day.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
That must have been a great gig.
it
Uh,
was. Mm.
and it was the first time I saw someone using limiter so liberally. Like he was limiting almost every drum track and most of the tracks. And I'm like, "You- what are you doing?" He's like, "Yeah, man. He's like, the reason that I limit everything, and I don't use this a lot in my own productions, but it's something that's in the back of my head sometimes, is he said, when you limit something, what you're doing is you're allowing the frequencies that don't normally hit at the same time to hit at the same time. So because the if you got a curve on a sound, right? You might somewhere in the mids, you're losing some of those high frequencies and some of the lows. It's kind of why people like using the OTT, right? Because it kind of brings that stuff up. But what he said is he would limit it so that it kind of brought up a broader range of frequencies. And then if he squashed it too much, he would just put the original back on top of it. So it was kind of worked like a parallel.
Mm.
Um, and his mixes always sounded really buttery and smooth and nice. I don't
Nice.
know, I only saw him work on one track while I was hanging at his house one time, but it taught me a little something that I experimented with.
That's cool.
And I'm sure there's more to it, but you know, if I can share anything,
Yeah,
it
that's
seems that limiting is because I used to think that limiting was kind of a bad thing, like only do it at the very end,
definitely not. Yeah, I
don't
used to
torture your
too.
mix. But you know what? It actually, there's something to be said about these things that we used to consider to be extremes.
Oh, for sure. I'm breaking all the rules that I learned in the beginning, to be honest with you.
Yeah, yeah, it's the same here. It's really different. And it's funny because it's like um it's the younger generation that we keep telling they're doing it wrong until all of a sudden they're doing it right and we're kind of doing it wrong.
Well,
It's
yeah, there's a lot of tools now that like let you break the rules. Because like
Yeah,
in earlier days, like of like DAWs, a lot of stuff was digitally clipping, and unless you're trying to go for that, now you
yeah,
have a
which
lot
is
of
an
like you
awful
have a lot of
sound.
stuff built in, like anti-aliasing built into most EQs now, and you've got um, you know, like I mentioned, FL Studio has like the clipping and built into their mixer, so like people can go crazy now with a little more peace of mind, and it just sounds better than it used to back in the day because the ones and zeros being processed much more efficiently too, with like all that stuff and oversampling. But yeah, I would. The other thing too, if I offered any other thing that I like to do as far as mixing goes, a lot of times I'll take like the OTT preset and I dry wet mix that on like almost every track. Like I'll just dry
Right.
wet mix it, even if it's like 20%.
Yeah,
Like
it's like parallel compression. It's almost like New York compression because it actually accentuates the lows and the highs in the same way that, you know, I I still use New York compression at times as like a return track, which
yeah,
is basically, a strong compressor, not extremely strong compressor, but it's getting stronger with modern production. But yeah, instead of boosting the lows and highs, I just dip the mids
yeah.
and then turn that up. And then when you mix that compressed version, you get to keep your transients while getting a thicker sound. And I think that's what the OTT is kind of doing
Yeah,
now.
yeah, for sure. So I usually like dry wet mix that to taste, and then I rarely put it on 100% ever. But then
Yeah.
I'll crank the output of the OTT. I'll turn up the output because it's going to get quieter as you compress it
Yeah.
into a glue compressor, and I don't touch the glue compressor. I'll just throw it on there, and then I'll turn on soft clip, and I'll turn up the makeup gain until I start to get a little bit of that yellow on the
Mm,
glue compressor because then you're compressing and saturating. And I'm not
right.
destroying it, but I'll turn on soft clip and I'll turn up that makeup gain on the glue compressor and drive the output of the OTT into the glue compressor. And you'll find that stuff just gets fatter. It just gets
Mm,
thicker and fatter, especially
that's a
for
great
lead
tip.
sounds or for basses or drums or whatever, literally anything. That's not like a background element. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the last things I was going to ask you is when you're working on something that you know is good, but it doesn't sound full enough, like it feels like it's missing something. Are there any techniques that you have to try to get new ideas into the song without like overkill?
I mean, that's a super loaded question, I
It
guess.
is loaded. I'm wondering if you add anything or process anything differently, layer something, or maybe you realize that there's enough in there, but sonically it has to do with the mixing. Like
Yeah,
what is it for you usually what are some of the solutions that have worked for you?
a lot of times I copy and paste or I resample stuff. So like I've been having a lot more fun just building out wild chains of stuff. Like here's an OTT, here's a glue compressor, I'm distorting it, I'm EQing it after that. And then maybe I'll throw like an Ableton echo on there and then I'll just like crank up the feedback until it's like 150%, and then you just get this weird destroyed wobble sound. And then I'll just like resample that into a new track, and then I'll take that and I'll like fade it, the new audio clip on the resample track, and I'll use that as like a build up somewhere else in the
Got it.
track. A lot of times if I feel stuck,
Yeah. So
best
so
thing
yeah,
to
so your
do,
philosophy is take something that's already in the track. So there's some similarity in
yeah,
the original source material.
yeah, for sure. Because I
Add it
used
back
to,
in a different processed way.
yeah, for sure. Because I find that if you just keep adding too many new elements, there's not a lot of consistency
I
in the,
agree.
and so find ways to get really weird and creative with what already exists. And even if it sounds like something completely different than what it is, it still comes from the same source, and you can get really creative with that. And so that's kind of my mentality now. And I'm becoming a lot more precious with my music and mixes where I'm like, oh, I don't want to mess it up. And usually when I start to feel that way is when I'm like, oh no, I definitely need to fuck this up.
Yeah, right.
I
Yeah,
need to
exactly.
go, and I need to go ham and do some. I'll just find weird effects in the audio effects folder, and I'll just start throwing stuff at it, and then just maybe like put an auto filter on there and make a weird warble sound, or like make a. I do save different chains that I have. Like I made an LFO EQ preset that can make stuff wiggle or like do some weird phasing
Yeah.
stuff and like flanging. So like
I
I
do a
guess
lot of kind of randomizing effect chains so I can just throw something in and it spits something else out. But like you said, the source material is the same.
yeah,
So you got this new idea that you can introduce either subtly or bring in at
yeah,
some point. I
yeah,
also find that octave layering is one of the easiest things you can do. Like sometimes a sound just isn't full enough because either it's missing the frequency is an octave lower or an octave higher. And you don't even need that much. It's just filling in a little bit of frequency space. Because at the end of the day, for a song to sound complete, what we're really looking for is just a completeness of the frequencies being filled up in the track, right?
yeah. Another thing
That
you
with the
can,
balance of groove,
yeah.
is like really, that's why there can be bands that only have three instruments because those instruments fill up enough of the frequency spectrum that you don't need more.
Yeah, for sure. I think saturation can help sometimes with that a little bit. I also think that, yeah, layering is great. I also like sometimes if I want to like layer something or put, if it's like missing a pad or something to kind of thicken it in the background, is I'll take like the reverb or the hybrid reverb and I'll like set it to like, say, like 70 or 80%. And then I will resample, I'll put that at the end of the chain, and then I'll resample that into a new track and I'll hit the freeze button. So when you freeze
Right.
it, and then it just freezes like that snapshot in sound of time, and then it'll just create this really cool pad like type of thing.
Yeah,
You can
yeah,
just kind of
absolutely.
tuck that into whatever that lead sound is and layer it that way too. It can be kind of a fun hack. I also really like Spectral Resonator. Have you played with that much? That thing's so wicked.
I played with it in the beginning and I saw others playing with it and I thought this is a really cool thing. I played with it and sometimes you're just not getting what you thought you were going to get out of it. And it takes a little while to fit, just like having a new synth or something.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes a while to get that one thing that it does really well. What is something that you like to do with that?
Honestly, it's fun on drums. Like
Really?
if you want to accentuate certain drum hits, I could put that like full dry wet on a return track and then send drums to it. You can like play with the octave, so then I'll take it and I'll like change it to like minus 12 semitones. You can set the key of that you're in, so you just pick the key and then you can change it to like a fifth or like raise it 12 semitones, full octave or whatever. You can create some weird like glitchy drum synth sounds with it. You can also do that same thing for like vocals is kind of fun too, or guitar even. You get some weird stuff with guitar.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
There's so that's fun. There's a plugin my friend like recently showed me called Chroma, Chroma. And what do they call it? It's like a harmonic,
I'm writing that one down.
it's a weird, it's not expensive. It's a harmonic sweetener, they call it. But you
Okay.
just pick, it's awesome for MIDI because then it kind of actually changes with the notes being played, but you can use it on audio too. But yeah, you basically just snap audio to any scale and then you can choose the frequency range and it creates this like dissonant pad sound. It can be really sick if you make like bass music, like any lead bass and you want to make it pretty. But you can put it on anything. I think it's really fun too.
Yeah, I'll probably have to dive back into uh, some of those tools. I think another thing I'll do when something's sounding a little empty is I always try taking some of the elements, double time it, half time it, and reverse it, and see if something inspires me. I don't use it as obviously a full track, but there's little pieces that you can put and shift. Or sometimes just when I reverse a sound, there's just a happy accident that happens through time that I wouldn't have expected. I just keep it and cut everything else out. Keep some of the bits that happen that I some of my favorite work is when a happy accident happens that I wouldn't have done myself
Yeah,
otherwise. I think there's something to be said of when you listen back to something that you didn't physically do from your own brain, the accidental thing just triggers the pleasure component of your brain a little bit more. So
yeah,
I like to do stuff like that
totally,
um, in order to get some inspired ideas.
for
But
sure.
those are, it's really, I try to tell people no matter how many new great tools come out, um, what's really happening is they're just trying to simplify the things that we do that can be a little bit more painstaking. But the ideas are generally the same, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're not trying new stuff, you're just gonna be caught into the same cycle of recreating the same thing over and over. So why not get out of the box and like either watch some tutorial videos or like find new effects that you haven't played with if you're using Ableton Live and abuse it.
Yeah, abusing tools. In fact, what I kind of suggest is that you have days of non-production where you don't have to accomplish anything. You just mess with something. And the accomplishment for me is just recording everything you do because something always comes out of it in some weird way, and I'll just, like Ill Gates likes to call those mud pies or whatever. But there's a lot of different ways to do mud pies or make really interesting effect chains and things like that. And these are great tools for inspiration, I think, that you can bring into a session. The last thing that I'd like to do, is I don't like to stop in the flow of creating, especially at least the first halfway through a track. Maybe later on I'll do a little bit more experimentation and stuff like that. But otherwise, I like to do those on separate days and just have either tools made or just have, a big grip of audio files that I can cut pieces from.
Yeah, man, for sure. Yeah, there's a million ways to do the same thing, right?
Yeah, there's a million ways to do the same thing. At the end of the day, we're all just trying to push the boundaries. And I think with music, we're constantly rediscovering ourselves, and that's why we evolve, is because we get better at finding our true passion. And those twists and turns is what makes it interesting because we're marrying old ideas with new ideas constantly.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps music exciting.
Also
But yeah,
collaborate too. I've been collaborating more now than I ever have been, and it's been really fun because I'm learning a lot and just seeing somebody else's creative approach to things I never would have thought of doing. So that's always fun. But yeah, dude, I do have another meeting, unfortunately. I wish I could stay and hang out longer. I have to go.
let's finish this up. Why don't you just tell people where they can find you, anything that you're up to, and so everyone on the podcast can hunt you down.
Yeah, absolutely, man. My Ableton website is liveproducersonline.com, like Ableton Live. So liveproducersonline.com is where I have all my training, and you can meet me, do a private lesson if you want. Also, if you just search Ableton Music Producer Podcast, you can find me pretty much anywhere, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, wherever you want. And then I'm just Ableton Podcast on the socials, or Instagram is usually where I hang out if you want to hang out there. And then also where I just post like random stupid stuff and music I'm making. If you want to hang out with me there, that's Philia Music, Philia Music on the gram as well. But yeah, dude, thanks for having me on the podcast. This is
Yeah,
it's always good
sure.
seeing your face. It's
Put
been a
the
long
stuff in the quote unquote show notes,
sure.
so people can hunt you down. Yeah, I'm surprised that we haven't connected before. So let's try to do this again at some point. I think people are going to get a lot of value from just this show. So yeah, guys, go and discover Dan's stuff because he's really one of the creative thinkers here in the Ableton and music production community. I think you'll get a lot out of him. Thanks for joining me today, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Take care, dude.
Yeah, you too, man. I'll see you later.